Hello and welcome back to AEF TV in association with Engerati. We're now joined by Oluniyi Robbin-Coker, who is the Minister of Energy for Sierra Leone. Thank you for making the time out of your, what I'm sure is a busy schedule to join us here. And we were talking a little bit off air about some of the challenges in Sierra Leone with what you're trying to do in terms of energy provision. And you were talking about the key thing is to try, what you're trying to solve is the mix between public and private funding and things like that. So tell us a little bit more about that challenge. It doesn't sound like a small one.
Well, my boss will always say that there's many challenges, but that's what it's all about. But let me first give you some context and background.
Sure.
We have an electricity sector, or power sector in particular, which has been very severely constrained over the last 20-25 years. Challenges with the management in the first instance meant that capital for reinvestment in the network was not available. And then we had a conflict period when nobody was willing to make any investments. We've emerged from that very strong in as far as we're ready to move forward. The network, the grid is nascent. We only distribute about 100 megawatts of power through the grid. We probably have 2 or 3 times that much which is off-grid generated electricity. But the big opportunity has now come because we now have a mining sector which is in production and set to grow. And so all of a sudden we find ourselves looking for up to 1,000 megawatts of installed capacity over the next 5 to 7 years, for which we're very convinced that there is a market. And in so doing, it has become crystal clear to us as government that this requires strong participation of the private sector.
So the growth of the mining sector is demanding more energy. You need to, so that demonstrates a market, a ready market to supply. Right.
Absolutely. And of course, even with the consumers and other industrials, clearly we're seeing more interest. Cement factories opening up, people want to do conversion of iron ore to steel, all demanding power. So the first policy decision we had to make was, do we allow people to self-generate or not? Well, we have decided we would prefer a situation where people buy power off the grid, allowing economies of scale for electrification to be more widespread.
You otherwise get into all these little pockets.
Exactly. And in so doing, I would say over the next 5 to 7 years, we anticipate that as we develop hydro, from which we get maybe about a 50% load factor, 50-55%, A, we need a large-scale thermal plant, which we're looking at on an IPP basis. B, we of course need to put in place transmission and distribution to distribute all this energy. And when we look at it, including regulatory issues, etc., we're looking probably at a budget of about $3.5 billion. Certainly, this is way more than our budget as a government can carry. And even with our support from our partners in development, it's still way beyond their capacity. And so we're looking for the private sector. However, what we as government need to do is to create that enabling environment for the private sector, and that involves bringing in our own revenues directly and money that we're able to access from partners in development.
I suppose you need to demonstrate that the market, if someone is to invest, there is a market, and people don't invest as charities, they want to see a return. So creating that market framework. So it's interesting because I had an interview with the head of the Nigerian regulatory board for energy. And I asked him the question and said, look, if anybody else is going down this journey, what are the things that should happen? And the 3 things he picked out is what you've kind of already touched on. But the first thing he said is the absolute demonstration of an independent regulator to give that confidence that that is going to be there. Are you there with an independent regulator, or is that all? Is it all so new? It's all part of the mix.
It's all part of the mix. I mean, what we do have in place is legislation to establish the Regulatory Commission. What we are working towards now, which is where the public money needs to be directed, is putting the function in place and giving it the capacity to be able to deliver. We're just about signed a contract with a consulting firm based in Europe to do an integrated resource planning study as well as a tariff study. Now, there's some argument to say that actually the planning is already happening, but maybe the study validates the planning. But the tariff is going to be an important issue. And once the tariff is set, we need to make sure that the regulator is able to manage around the tariff. Now, let me give you the flip side. I'm talking to colleagues in other countries recently at an ECOWAS ministers meeting, and they all have some amount of concerns around the regulator and their inflexibility around tariff. And here's the reality. A lot of these countries are still very dependent on heavy fuel oil. As you know, oil prices have gone up, 50, 70, 100% over the last 5 years, and the tariffs aren't reflected. So it's creating its own dynamic because you now have an independent regulator, but he is not sensitive necessarily to the needs of the distribution company.
And then taking that one step further, I would imagine you've got a social challenge as well, where, and this is one of those things about energy, and maybe a bit like water, sometimes, well, it is a human right, one could argue. And then you have, you're trying to commercialize it with tariffs, and you're like going, well, how do we get that human right to people who can't necessarily afford the tariff? I don't know how to solve that problem, but it must be a part of the challenge.
Well, no, certainly it is a part of the challenge, and it's not, I think we're all in agreement that a human right does not mean that it's free. But we need to bend over backward to make it affordable. Yeah. And we do have that in our tariff system right now. We do have a social tariff, and we have a commercial and industrial tariff. So we manage that process well. But even with that, when you look at the energy mix and the dynamic of the petroleum sector, if you're petroleum or hydrocarbon heavy, you have a problem. Now, we as a country are focused on renewable energy and sustainable development through green growth. Having said that, if my hydro has a huge capex and a load factor of 55% due to seasonality, then I still need some more.
You need a buffer.
I need a buffer, I need a base load. Yeah. And I'm depending on the private sector to bring that in, which means I have to have a tariff, A, which is attractive enough for them to get paid. B, I have the ability to collect revenues for them because I have a distribution network. And too often in the discussion, it is the distribution that people don't talk enough about. Yes. Everybody is willing to be an IPP, but it is that rare animal that is willing to put risk capital into the distribution element. And traditionally, it is the development financing that has gone into distribution. And now we have an environment where private capital is willing to go into distribution, which means development financing needs to roll back and focus on the soft issues, the capacity building, the feasibility studies that allows me to engage 3 or 4 different people in a competitive bid.
And it's a hugely complex challenge, because I remember one interviewee, and I can't remember exactly the one, but the notion stuck in my head where they were saying that Africa has an opportunity to do things differently. It has an opportunity to learn. It has an opportunity to, grasp the renewable model and perhaps do something differently, because there's a lot of talk about renewables. And I would imagine that one of the things that it allows you to do is use renewables to sort of drive sort of pockets of power where you are incredibly rural, where it doesn't make sense to build a pylon network out to that. So that's part of your mix as well.
No, absolutely. Let me cannot overemphasize that. So when we look, for example, at what we're calling rural electrification, which essentially is going to be our off-grid, mini-grid strategy, it is very much based on what are the available resources to provide energy security in that particular locality. Is it biomass? Is it solar? Is it wind? When in Sierra Leone it's not likely going to be wind. Is it mini hydro? Is it a combination of that? Okay, so that's critically important. But then again, almost all renewable energies apart from biomass are subject to variations of seasonality and time of day, etc., etc.
Yeah, the sun shines
so
when the sun wants to shine.
Exactly.
Right?
So you have to have that hybrid solution, and that's what we're looking to do. But beyond the rural electrification, even for the base load, as I said, you need to have a reliable, consistent base load, and you need to be able to deliver that to the consumer. And private money is now more and more ready to be deployed into the distribution.
And what you were saying earlier, I suppose what you've done is and are on the road to doing is creating that framework of confidence that private company, because I read an Ernst & Young report where they're looking at I think it's the Africa Effectiveness Report, and they did a survey, and there's a big demarcation between companies already in Africa, companies looking at Africa, and one of the key things that came out was that confidence in terms of regulatory framework. Well, the two biggest things were transport infrastructure and transparency of governance and things like that. So, and that's part of your journey, I suppose, as well.
Absolutely, and in fact, frankly, that is one of the key reasons I came to this event, because when I looked at the brochure and I looked at some of the names that are here, they are private sector, they have a proven track record in Africa, and quite a few of them are already knocking on my door. In fact, in one particular instance, I am in very advanced discussions with Copperbelt Energy Corporation, who are going to be doing an investment into the grid, as well as a IPP solution. They started with the IPP, they recognized that the grid was not there to absorb the capacity. We discussed what our requirements for the grid are. We realized that this is not money that the government itself was going to be able to raise directly or through its development financing institutions, and therefore they're willing to step in. And this is where Africa not only has the opportunity to do things differently, but has a responsibility to do things differently and to begin to create the new best practice.
Yes.
You know, we can't take the old best practice models and apply them in an environment which is as dynamic as Africa.
Well, to be quite honest, the old best practice models are starting to creak
already. So we're looking at new best practice models. Africa has a huge power deficit. You cannot come up with the same solutions that you used in the UK and the US and, you know, maybe even Asia a little at this time.
To be quite honest, we don't want to, do we?
No. I mean, first of all, they were carbon dominant. We're focusing on that energy mix, which makes renewable energy the bulk of the energy, but that base load that says consistent, reliable electricity is available.
Well, it's been fascinating talking to you, and I'm sorry to say we're at the end of our time. I feel like we could explore a multitude of things, but it's encouraging. Must be encouraging for you that you've already got people knocking on your door, and so the work you've done is there. And you know, we were talking off air. You have no doubt that there's a challenger ahead, and I wish you luck with that. I wish you a successful visit here, and if we can squeeze in another interview, I'd love to ask you some more questions, but we'll see whether we can make that happen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching.